I want to pick up on the U.S.-China relationship, Jessica Matthews, because China figured prominently in the presidential campaign. Both candidates vowed to sort of get tough on China. And as we speak, there's a once-in-a-decade political transition taking place in Beijing. The 18th Communist Party Congress is meeting to install new leadership. What do you think this transition to a new generation of political leaders in China means for Washington and the U.S. approach to China, which of course President Obama referred to as both a partner and an adversary?
Right, and that's what China is. But the reality is that China is also growing economically, even if it grows more slowly. And it wants to, and President Xi has already telegraphed in his trip here that China is looking for a different nature to the strategic relationship that recognizes its greater weight in the world that flows from its economic successes. That could be, it could be positive, it could be manageable, or it could be awfully conflictual, right? And it really depends on the tone of the conversations and what one hears from what the other side says, and trying to distinguish rhetoric from real policy. If either side is looking for conflict, then they will surely find it, because this is a difficult time. In history has very few examples of a rising power that comes into an established world order and doesn't disrupt it, doesn't cause active conflict. So this is a toughie, but it's one that I think there's no choice but that the U.S. has to find a way to manage through, and that will be right up there among the top half dozen priorities for the new president on both sides.
President Obama telegraphed in his first term that we were pivoting toward Asia, and that this was a policy designed, if not overtly, at least somehow more implicitly, to counterbalance China's growing influence in the region. And we're seeing territorial disputes between China and Japan, and of course in the South China Sea. How do you see this pivot playing out concretely?
I think the pivot turned out to be, it's funny in international affairs how often one word or one phrase can do so much damage. And the pivot, because it was announced in a kind of military context, did an enormous amount of damage. And it looked like a way of saying, okay, a decade of war in the Middle East, we're now finished with that. We're taking these military forces of this military weight and we're putting them in Asia. And we have to walk away from that. We have to walk that back. It already has been walked back in a rhetorical sense. Now everybody talks about rebalancing American attention, which is fine. It also does, a pivot. In a pivot, you turn your back on somebody, right? And so it had a terrible effect in Europe as well, because it looked like we were turning our back on the Atlantic. We have to make the pivot, the rebalancing, mean the U.S. is an Asian power. It's always been an Asian power. The U.S. has entirely legitimate economic and political as well as security interests in the region. That's what we have to make it mean. And most importantly, the U.S. is not looking for a presence in Asia that asks Asian countries to choose between an alliance with the U.S. and an alliance with China. That's the key. And that's going to take a sophisticated policy where on the one hand we have an active, constructive presence, but we do not do it as this is a choice that you, the Philippines, you, Malaysia, you, Indonesia, whatever, have to choose. That would be a disaster. So this is a sophisticated policy demand, but one that I think we have no choice but to follow.